Welcome back to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I am your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. Everybody, welcome back to another episode of the History of the Papacy podcast. In this series, we've been doing a lot of speculations, and in this time of the year, we are rapidly, if you're listening to this when the episode releases, it is Passover/Easter time, and the best thing to do to talk about Passover and Easter is to talk to Gil Kedron of the podcast of Biblical Proportions. Gil, how are you doing?
Hi, Steven. Hey, thank you for having me.
Oh, it is my pleasure. Now, Gil, you have some interesting thoughts on Passover, and we've discussed it, and you see two layers. Well, even before we get into the layers, in the broadest strokes, I mean, I can't imagine there's too many people out there who don't know what Passover is, but in the broadest strokes, what is Passover?
It's actually a very good question because Passover is many, many things. It's called the Festival of Spring, Chag HaAviv. It's called the Festival of the Flattened Bread, Chag HaMatzot. And it's called the Festival of Freedom, the Chag HaCherut, or Festival of Liberty, more accurately. And in the Bible, it's also the first day of the year, the beginning of the year. So it's a lot of things crammed into one festival, which means that there are a lot of layers. So if you ask what is Passover, you have to decide at what time we're talking about, and then we'll get a different answer. Today, Passover is like a holiday, right? You get together with your family. You have like a big family table with all kinds of small dishes that they are all symbolic. It's called the Seder, the Passover Seder, Passover dinner. And there's like a theme of hospitality with an empty chair. And that's basically it. But it has very, very ancient origins. And I think that through the rules of the ancient Passover in the Bible, we can see the roots of this festival. Because the very idea of having a spring festival, that's 6,000 year old, basically.
And so you subscribe to the general academic and scholarly interpretation that there's two layers built into this Passover story. What are the two layers?
Yeah, so as I was researching Passover for my podcast, I learned that they found the two layers there, academics. And so the way they divide it is they said that the older layer is more universal, not specifically Hebrew. It's more like a regional thing that people were celebrating the spring festival everywhere. So it's more seasonal, right? And it's more symbolic. And the second layer is a more nationalistic layer or national layer. It's harsher a little bit. It tells you who can and cannot attend Passover, who is included, who is excluded, how exactly you have to do everything. And there's even, like a threat of violence, let's say. And the universal layer has a threat of excommunication. If you don't do this, then you're out of the group. So basically, those are the two layers, according to academics. I agree with that 100%. And I think that if we try to place these two layers at specific periods in time, I don't think it's very hard. Because there's only one universal period in the ancient world, like a truly universal period. That's the Persian period, where they rule the world from one side of the globe to the other of the known world, so to speak. And there's only one nationalistic period in Hebrew history that comes later, because the nationalistic layer comes later, and that's the Maccabean times, when the Hebrews get national independence and they do a lot of national writing. And once we look at those two layers as written in these two periods in time, everything just slides together. And if we look a little bit ahead, we can see how it connects to Easter.
Yeah, I think that you can't even argue with it, that makes perfect sense, that it would have that universal character in the ancient times, and then that leads into getting a new, basically nationalistic paint job to it in Maccabean times. I mean, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, we do the same things right today. Like some of our celebrations today, if we look back, we can see how much changed throughout, Christmas and Valentine's and all kinds of stuff that's from Roman times, and it was about something completely different. And just like whenever you have, things change, you adapt the way that you celebrate whatever it is. Like Christmas even today is different than Christmas when you were a kid, I bet. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And so really this whole story comes out of 2 chapters of Exodus. Who wrote this? What do scholars think, and what do you think? Who wrote these sections? Is this do we go back to Ben Neria and Jeremiah? Steve here again. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like Josh Cohen's Eyewitness History and many other great shows. Go to Parthenon Podcast to learn more. And now, here is a quick word from our sponsors.
I know it's not these guys. According to the documentary hypothesis, that's like an academic hypothesis that divides the first books of the Bible to 4 different schools of writing, let's say. And just to simplify it, let's say that there are 2 schools of thought, 2 groups, priests and the non-priests, people who are not. So the first layer, they say that the priests wrote it. It's assigned to the priests. And the second layer is just assigned to a later layer, the redactor or some unnamed later person or, political movement or whatever it is. And it's interesting because there is a very growing consensus that the priestly texts were written in Persian times. Not really controversial to say that the priestly texts were written in Persian time. So this again fits very, very well with that. And what other period after Persian times could have nationalistic rules added to the most important Hebrew festival, but at Maccabean times, I cannot see, there is no other period. Like it's not that in the 350s in the, Persian times, somebody comes in and writes like a nationalistic manifesto to change the rules. Why? Radically change the rules, right? It should be said that the Passover rules in Exodus 12 and 13, the nationalistic one, they are in direct contradiction with the priestly Passover rules, which we can find in Deuteronomy 16. Okay, we have the rules there where you have to go to the temple. It's clear that it's not controversial that it's priestly rules, and they come in direct contrast. Priestly rules say Passover, you have to go to the temple. The Exodus rules say Passover, you have to stay at home. You cannot leave your house. So there were some editing jobs done there, and it fits with Maccabean history because we know that that's when the temple priests were toppled and persecuted.
You get into that so much in your podcast. A lot of the Bible has been redacted and edited, and some of those edits are super smooth. And unless you know what you're looking for, it's really hard to see. In other ones, it's the obvious things that you're like, wow, that is a really choppy transition from one thing to the next. And some of those choppiness, you can definitely get that choppiness in the Exodus story.
Yeah, I love those because it's like hole in the space-time continuum or something, and you can just through clashes if you just focus on the clash, you see, okay, why does this sentence begin this way and then turn into something else and then go back? And once you try to, pull the strings and go, chase the leads, you can understand the logic. Why would someone change this, change that? A lot of changes and re-changes and re-changes that go much farther in history than academics are willing to admit. They think that no more changes to the Hebrew Bible were done after, I think, 250 BCE. But I don't think that this is correct. I think it goes even beyond 140 BCE. I'm starting to think that it goes a little bit farther.
Such a huge part of that story is the setting and the setting of Egypt. Why did writers writing in Persian times and then into basically Hellenistic Greek times put their setting in Egypt and basically, at the very least, time immemorial? It's maybe 1,000 years, several hundred years at least before their time.
Yeah, this is a very interesting quirk of history. The way that I traced it, okay, so the Hebrews, the Israelites, okay, from the ancient kingdom of Israel, that was destroyed by the Assyrians in 722 BC. Okay, so those guys, before they were destroyed, they had these communal stories of having escaped from Egyptian persecution or oppression, something vague. We're not sure exactly how it went down, but they had these stories. And the oldest story of this time that we can see, it's in Exodus. It's called the Song of the Sea. I don't remember which chapter it is, but the Song of the Sea is like maybe Exodus 16 or 18, something like that. So they had this old communal memory of being in Egypt. And then when the Babylonians destroyed Judea and deported Judeans to Babylonia, the stories that they wrote about their captivity in Babylonia, but they wrote it in Egypt. First of all, because you already had these stories in Egypt, and it's basically you're adding to the universe, and you make it you make the old stories relevant because and you give hope. We did it once, we'll do it again. It makes sense. We do it today, even in movies and stories, like a remake. And another more, prosaic reason, they couldn't write about Babylonia because they were in Babylonia and they would die. We have evidence of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, burning Hebrews who are bad mouths in Babylon. So they set it in Egypt. And they also had a good reason to be angry at Egypt, who basically let them fall into Babylonian hands and they didn't come to help them as they promised. So the first story is the first layer of Exodus is a desperate layer. It's very anxious. These stories were written during Babylonian times. And for example, when Moses says, "Let my people go," the entire sentence is, "Let my people go to the desert to worship Yahweh on his mountain." So this is like the first layer. Then after Babylonia fell and the Persians came in and ushered in this universal period. So in 539 BCE, they conquered Babylonia, and in 538 BCE, they allowed all the prisoners and political captives to return, including the Hebrews. That's the return to Zion. And that's when the old stories of being stuck in Egypt and being anxious and angry all the time were given a second version that has a happy ending, a return to your ancestral homeland. So basically this return to Zion became the story of the return from Egypt. Okay, and this was turned into the first Passover.
I think that makes so much sense too, because the way I always interacted with the text, and I think that's probably generally universal, is it almost is like sci-fi, that Egypt to back to the land of Israel is like us going to Mars. But at that time, it's what? Could have been a 2-day boat ride at the very worst and a week's journey by foot. But it makes a lot more sense if you're writing that in Babylon, where Egypt almost is Mars in comparison.
And also, they leave Egypt in Exodus, right? But they don't go straight up north and get to the land of Judea. They have to have some excuse in the story. So they go and enter the land by crossing the Jordan River, which is what the Hebrews returning to Zion from the Babylonian captivity in 538. That's where they crossed, because they came straight from the east. And they wrote about it, that they crossed the Jordan River. And the guy that led them, the high priest, the first high priest of the second temple, his name was Joshua. And he crossed the Jordan River. And there's a story about the Joshua, at the end of the Exodus, that crosses the Jordan River, and a lot of similarities. So this is basically because this, cinematic universe, quote unquote, of a captivity in Egypt was created during the captivity. They just kept going back to it. Even later in Maccabean times, 140 BC, then the Egyptians, they became a stand-in for the Seleucid Empire, the Hellenists. Now the Egyptians became like really, really vicious. In the stories written by priests, the Pharaoh and the Egyptians, they're not vicious, because we already know that it has a happy ending. So it's like more, that's when the magicians try to stop the plagues and they fail. It's not really violent. It's more like, ha, ha, ha. So just like each layer is a little bit different depending, the period that we live in. Like if you today would write a new story for the 10 plagues and the Exodus, you would emphasize certain things from your world, the way that you see the world. So it's the same.
That makes a lot more sense. That was always something discordant with me. And I wouldn't have been able to even verbalize that. Why does Joshua cross the Jordan when that would not be in any really logical way? You'd be going through the southern Levant, or, crossing from the desert land to the more fertile lands of southern Canaan. Yeah. Coming in from the Jordan, that would have been monumental for the Judeans returning from points east. Wow.
Exactly. Then they want to write a story that commemorates that. It's just like for people who are not really into, Levantine geography, it's like you're in Mexico and you want to get to, let's say New York. Okay. So instead of just going straight up north from Mexico to New York, you go to Iceland, and then from Iceland you go back to New York. Why would you do that? That makes no sense. No one would do this.
No, it doesn't. It wouldn't make sense logically, or if you were creating a story for it, it would be making the story for the people who were understanding it in the 500s. Exactly. Oh, we crossed the Jordan. That's the door. And I think for people out there, it does you can get like on Google Earth a sense of the geography. I mean, I've never been. It might be a little bit before I do get a chance to go.
Yeah. Wait a little bit.
You can see where the fords are, and it makes a lot of sense that would have been monumental to cross the Jordan, where it would have been crossing from Egypt is just kind of desert blending into pasture land.
And also think about it. The return to Zion is the greatest event in ancient Hebrew history. Okay, that and 140 BC, the Hebrew independence out of the MacLeod. Let's put that aside a little bit. The return to Zion is a monumental event. We can read so many songs about it. So much of Psalms is about that. Where is the holiday, the festival that celebrates it? Where is it? Why don't we have a celebration for the return to Zion? Why do we have a celebration for the return from Egypt so much supposedly before that, but we don't celebrate the return to Zion? That doesn't make any sense. There has to be a festival about that. Why isn't there a festival about the road that they took from Zion? They had their holy artifacts, their holy stuff. Why isn't there a festival about that? Them carrying their holy artifacts, or maybe sleeping on the road, in like makeshift shacks. In the Return to Zion, we do have festivals about that. That's called Passover. The Ark of the Covenant that they carry, this is Simchat Torah, I think. This is one of, and we have Sukkot, where Shavuot, maybe it was the other one. I haven't got into it yet on my podcast. And then Sukkot, when they have I don't know how you say Sukkah in English. It's like the temporary housing that they have.
The tabernacle.
Tabernacle, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Oh, wait a second. Future Steve speaking here. I actually made a mistake. The building for that holiday that Gil was referring to in Hebrew, Sukkot, is not tabernacle in English. It is booths. So that's where we would get the Festival of Booths you may be more familiar with. Sorry about that, but let's get back into it.
So all these festivals are in Exodus, and they all fit what actually happened in history, but supposedly it's not about that. Okay. I don't know why.
And you see those bones, that basic bone of a tribal Canaanite people who are semi-nomadic with the tabernacle that you've got to pack up this, or the Shavuot and Sukkot, they're the same thing. It just
No, it's a little bit different. The two different holidays today. Shavuot is nothing like it was in the ancient times, so I will only really dive into it in a few weeks when I get to it.
But this basis of a mobile, semi-nomadic people, and then you build on these layers after layers, it makes a lot of sense. Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors.
I gotta wait 1 second. It's me. Sorry. I just had Sfiata over. Why? Oh, I can't believe it. Why? Just now. Okay, but as you were talking about Shavuot, I got like a flashback that it is 49 days after Passover. Okay. So this is another link that I just didn't know because I didn't have the chance to get into that. But the Jerusalem temple was destroyed in 587 BC. 49 years later, the Hebrews returned to Zion. Okay, from 587 BCE to 538 BC. 49 is not a random number. I mean, it might be a random number, but it was very, very important for the Hebrews back then and for the Persian world. 7 is a holy number, very auspicious number. This is why the week has 7 days. And 7 times 7, 49, is the best number ever. And they happened to go back. A miracle happened to them 49 years, 7 times 7 years after their worst disaster. And then they started thinking in 49 years, and 49 became also, I think it's an important number also in Christianity, right? And that. And so here they have their second celebration 7 weeks after they left, okay? After they left the return to Zion, whatever, after they left from Egypt or from Babylonia, Persia, however you want. So this is obviously related to that. It's not an accident that it's 49 weeks to match the 49 years that the Hebrews stayed in the Babylonian captivity. This is, confirmed. People can look it up. So just like the more that we get into it, the more we will see that this is exactly what it is. I don't want to get into like a thousand minutia stuff, but I think it's hard to find some cracks in this speculation. I think it's pretty solid speculation.
So it's about 200 or 300 years-ish between when the Judeans and the Jews, if you prefer, they are allowed to go back onto the land by the Persians. What's happening to them when they're allowed to go back and they reestablish the temple? They do those things. Was it creating new stories at that time?
So now let me get to some speculation, okay? Because this is not something that I like thoroughly vetted, but it fits the overall picture and it makes sense. So let's go with that. So I think that they went back to the land and they didn't know who was there. And I think people were there that were no longer Hebrew or in whatever way you want to call it. Like you said, Judeans, Jews, I call it Hebrews just because, it's not the way that they describe themselves, but it includes both Judeans and Israelites, and it's just simple. And Jews, that term didn't exist back then. It was only Judeans. So let's call them Hebrews. There were people there who were no longer Hebrews, and since the return is 538 BCE, and the establishment of the Second Temple is 516 BC or 515 BC, there's like a good 20 years between that. You can imagine that it wasn't smooth, that they had problems taking back their ancestral land, that the people living there didn't really want them to come in and take their stuff. And that some people had different agendas and said, let's go to this mountain, let's go over there, because this is all in the stories that we have, right? It fits all the stories in, Leviticus and Numbers and beyond, Joshua and beyond. And I think that so this is like the state of affairs. And then we have Ezra, the scribe, coming in 100 years later. And he finds out that nobody is following the rules, that people don't take it nearly as seriously as he thought they should. And this is like more of a, symbolic thing. And they're not, they're marrying, the priests are marrying non-Hebrew women, and they don't know all the stories and they don't really care. They're minding their own business. And he comes in and he makes everything more harsh and everything more strict. And I think this is where you get the rules in Passover that say that you will be ostracized from the community if you don't do things exactly by the book. You have to burn all your yeast. And also the thing about the yeast and the flattened bread, that also makes sense if we look at the return to Zion. Just fits like a glove. Do you want me to get into it?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about that, and then we can circle back around because I have some questions that maybe we can speculate on at this time period. But I am interested. I think that that's such an iconic part of the story, the no yeast and flat bread.
Exactly. So here, I will go by what academics say. That I looked into it and I agree with what we did 100%. But this is like not my theory. This has to do with a symbolic new beginning of every year. This is not a strictly Hebrew thing. I call it good juju. Okay, so you start the new year, and then you don't want to use stuff from the previous year at the beginning of the year. You want to open the new year in a positive way, not bring in the trouble from the previous year. And the year begins on the first day of spring. This has been the custom. This is when the world awakened. They said this is the first day of the spring, hence this is when the year begins. So this is something that is like a generally accepted, and we even do it today. You have a wedding, you wear new clothes. Have a baby, first baby, you give him new clothes, not used clothes. It's something like that. But then something happened in 538 BCE that on the first day of the year, which is the first day of spring, the Hebrew world changed so much in just by one day. Cyrus, king of Persia, saying everybody is free on the first day of spring, that the difference between this year that began with salvation and the previous year that we were still in captivity, the difference was so stark that it became entrenched. On the first 7 days of spring, you are not allowed to use any yeast. Why? And now this goes to what scholars have, figured out. At the beginning of the spring, you have barley crops that you can use, but you don't yet have wheat crops. They will take a few weeks longer. So to prepare yeast, you have to take wheat flour with water and let it ferment for 7 days. So the yeast that you have at the beginning of spring is by default spring wheat from the previous spring and the previous year, right? Because now the year just began. So at first, January 1st, if you have yeast, definitely it was prepared with flour and wheat from December 31st, okay, the previous year. So they didn't want to eat, to use it, it became really important. I wouldn't use any yeast from the previous year. If this happened now, no, I'm not saying if I were an ancient person. Like it's a like symbolic things have a lot of significance, right? They're not something to be scoffed at or discarded. And it also explains, so it works 7 days. This is why Passover has 2 days, 2 holidays. The first day of spring, it's announced they can go back home. 7th day of spring, it says in the Passover rules, why do you celebrate the 7th day? Because on this very day, I took you out of Egypt. Basically, I think that on the 7th day of spring, 538 BCE, they set out on their journey back home with all their huge delegation 40,000 people. This is the return to Zion. And they're not the only ones that are free, right? Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people returning home because everybody were free. And it also fits with what Exodus tells us who leaves Egypt. Hebrews and Erev Rav, a lot of other peoples that weren't in the story before that, right? In the stories of Exodus, I didn't read anything about other peoples wanting to leave. But a lot of other people, not just Hebrews, left Babylonia/Persia on the spring of 538 BC. So it seems that this just works. And then Ezra, when he came in, 100 years later, he's like, now you have to burn all the yeast, and if you touch the yeast, he was just more strict about it in general.
And we're going to wrap up today's episode right here. But if you enjoy what you're hearing, come and check us out on part 2 of this episode. While you're waiting, it would be great if you could leave a rating and review on iTunes. Go like us on our Facebook page and group and all of our other social media. We'll talk to you next time. Hey, before we go, let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the history of the Papacy Diptychs. We have, at the Alexandria level, Roberto, William B., Brian, Christina, Augustus, Judy, and Max. At the Constantinople, we have Dapo, Paul, Justin, Lana, John, Steve, and Sean, all of whom are magnificent and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome. We have Peter the Great, Amma the Great, Jeffrey the Great, Frederick the Great, and Jim the Great. With that, I hope you enjoy this next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church.